Please welcome Cecilia Kang, reporter at the New York Times, and our speakers, Nathaniel Fick, the U.S. Ambassador at Large for Cyberspace and Digital Policy at the U.S. Department of State, and Brad Smith, Vice Chair and President of the Microsoft Corporation.
Can you hear me? Hi, so we are the last panel of the morning, standing between you and lunch. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Ambassador and Brad, for attending this conversation on cyber diplomacy. Let's start off with sort of an update on where cyber diplomacy stands today and how the dynamics between the private and public sector has evolved, and more recently, over the last year or so. And maybe, Ambassador, you can start.
I think, well, first of all, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you, Cecilia, Brad, thank you. I think the trend line, there are headlines and trend lines, right? And every day in this space brings a headline, whether it's Volt Typhoon or Flax Typhoon or exploding pagers, there's always something. The trend line, from my perspective, is the migration of cyber and tech diplomacy from the periphery to the center. And a few concrete examples. We had Secretary Blinken at RSA on the main stage launching the U.S. International Cyber and Digital Strategy. First time a sitting Secretary of State has appeared at that conference. We've trained 200 cyber diplomats and put them at our embassies around the world. And last example, for the first time ever, a commitment to these issues is one of the top 5 selection criteria for career U.S. ambassadors. So in our diplomacy, again, I think it's a migration from the periphery to really the center and the core, and recognizing that it's intrinsic to everything we do.
And Brad, in your role at Microsoft, I've seen you sort of take on more of a diplomatic role as well. Can you talk about from the private sector how things have changed and from where you're sitting?
Yeah, I would say 2 things. First, I just want to build on what Ambassador Fick, I call you Nate for this purpose, what Nate said. Look, one of the most important things I think of the last year and last few years is that the U.S. government and the State Department are back in the center of multilateral diplomacy, playing a leadership role on cyber issues. And that is indispensable to technology and to the world, and it's important to have not only a position and a team, but frankly, just a great ambassador and leader. It's made a world of difference for all of us in the tech sector. And then second, as you noted, Cecilia, it is not multilateralism for governments alone. Because cyberspace is fundamentally and typically owned and operated by the private sector, by tech companies, I do think multilateralism has become multi-stakeholderism. You do see tech companies showing up, offering a point of view, and civil society. And so I think that's where we do our best work. It's almost the only way we can do good work is to bring all 3 pillars, if you will, together.
Let's shift a little bit to the threat landscape and what you're seeing today, some of the biggest threats at hand. And maybe, Ambassador, you can start.
I think when we talk about the threat landscape, it's important to keep our ultimate objective in mind. And my view, I think our view of the ultimate objective is that we have to sustain at least a basic level of trust in the digital world. We have to have trust in our supply chains. We have to have trust in the integrity of information. We have to have trust in user privacy. We have to sustain trust if it's all going to work, if it's actually going to be a reliable architecture undergirding the 21st century economy and undergirding how humans interact all around the world on every topic. And so if you look at it that way, then you sort of turn the map around on the adversary and think about, okay, what are the threats to trust? And the threats to trust are fundamentally untrustworthy infrastructure that has no data privacy safeguards. Threats to information integrity in fundamental ways that are essential to the functioning of a democratic society. In addition to all of the more kind of point threats in a particular geopolitical hotspot or on a particular issue.
And how about you, Brad? What do you see in terms of the threat landscape?
I think the threat landscape, unfortunately, continues to become, I'll say, more diverse and more sophisticated, and it's more hazardous. And it reflects everything that Nate just said and more. I tend to focus at least on two big buckets of issues. One is around cyber attacks, efforts to penetrate networks and either steal information or actually put a government or someone else in a position to damage and take offline, fundamentally destroy information infrastructure. We're seeing 340 million password-based attacks on Microsoft customers, 340 million every day. That's not a year, that's a day. That is astonishing, or it should be. And we have to be careful that we just don't become inured to it. We track 160 nation-state attackers, and that does, I think, unfortunately reflect a lawlessness in cyberspace. And then in addition to that, we see increasingly sophisticated, frankly clever, well-resourced cyber influence operations, fundamentally by three countries that are in that business, and they're very good at what they do. And this year is a year where I think quite rightly we're all focused on the protection of elections, and we need to be.
Yeah, and that's a good segue into the election space. And there are 2/3 of the world will have an election this year. And the US elections are coming within weeks. You just reported, Microsoft just reported, Brad, about the detection of a Russian-backed campaign against the Harris Walls campaign. Tell us about what you're seeing on the election side in terms of threats, as well as what could be coming. There's a lot of talk about already, maybe too soon, that this was not the AI disinformation election that people feared. Is it too early to say that? And what are you seeing down the pike?
Well, let's talk about the United States for a moment, because right now we're seeing vigorous activity. We're seeing the Iranians really target the Republican Party in the Trump campaign. We're seeing the Russians target the Democratic Party and now the Harris campaign. We're seeing those two countries in China, I'll just say, share a common interest in discrediting democracy itself. We've seen, starting in May, increasingly sophisticated Iranian activity to penetrate network accounts. It's a classic, prelude to hack and leak operations. If you can steal the email in June, you can use it in October. And you can even change the email. You got plenty of months to rewrite it and make it look like it's even different from what was originally said. We're seeing active cyber influence campaigns, the production of videos, the production of purportedly accurate news stories, audio, you name it, that's the format. AI is being used increasingly, especially for text and probably most especially for audio. I think AI is hard at this point to use effectively for video for a variety of reasons, but wait 2 or 4 years and that's going to get harder as well. The interesting thing about these kinds of influence operations is if you want to go back to the Steve Jobs adage, he said every day he worked at the intersection of engineering and the liberal arts. That's where cyber influence thrives. When an adversary can bring together all of the technology expertise and the liberal arts, because that's what you need. You have to be plausible in order to be credible and have an impact. And that social science background is maybe even more important than the engineering background. And the Russians especially have that.
Sure, and Ambassador, what are you seeing on the global landscape in terms of elections? And maybe you can talk about some of the coordination you're doing with the private sector on that.
Certainly. So thankfully, we have very capable colleagues in the US government, the Department of Homeland Security, at NSA and Cyber Command, who are focused every day on safeguarding the integrity of the US election. The role of the State Department in that regard is primarily outside the United States, of course, and it really takes two forms. The first is conveying a very clear message to our adversaries that we view interference in our democratic process as dangerous and escalatory and unacceptable. And that's a message that we convey bilaterally and multilaterally in many places all the time. The second primary role that the State Department plays, and this really is hand in hand with Brad's team and others, is safeguarding the integrity of the electoral process among our allies and partners. And we're doing that in many different geographies. To your point, Cecilia, we have elections all around the world this year. And we're working hand in hand, yes, on providing software, but also on building capacity and trying to create more long-term capability among our allies and our partners in anticipation that this landscape is going to remain really challenging for a long time.
And I think that you might have mentioned Moldova as a good example of one of the partnerships you have.
So we work kind of up and down the eastern flank of NATO, as you might expect, and beyond NATO, in other parts of Eastern Europe, where there are elections upcoming, and the Russians are interested in deploying kind of the full spectrum of their capability to sway those outcomes. Everything from direct cyber attacks to information campaigns to sort of an increasingly troubling series of hybrid attacks that cross over into the kinetic world and that actually do things that I think only a short time ago we would have found extraordinarily surprising.
And I would just, could I say, everybody in the United States and everybody in the world over the next 6 weeks should pay more attention to Moldova. And that probably sounds like a funny thing to say, because I think for most Americans, it's like, wait, where's Moldova? And the answer is it's a country the size of Maryland on the southwest border of Ukraine. So think about Ukraine. It's got Russia to the east, Belarus to the north, Crimea that's been peeled off on the southeast. Now you have Moldova on the southwest. They have an election on the 20th of October. It's going to be one of the most important elections of 2024, I think, in terms of what it takes to protect a democracy, because they are going to be voting on two things. One is the leadership of the country with a pro-European EU candidate and a pro-Russian candidate and an EU referendum. And it's a country of only 2.5 million people. Think of it as twice the size of Estonia, but a key strategic location. It's a country where the Russians have long had many assets. We saw a lot of activity against Moldova when the war began 2.5 years ago in Ukraine. And yeah, it is, I think, of vital importance to NATO, to Europe, to the European Union, and frankly to democracy. So yeah, it's one where the world, I think, to some degree, really needs to come together and protect Moldova.
Thank you for explaining that. So Brad, I want to go back to something that the ambassador said, which is in terms of threats, trust is really an important thing that needs to be earned as well as maintained. And Microsoft over the past several months has really endured a lot of skepticism and scrutiny of its ability to respond to security and security flaws. In the June hearing, it was you testified. I don't need to remind you, but you did.
I remember that hearing. Yeah.
Yes.
I try to forget it, but I remember.
Yeah. The word trust came up quite a bit. We don't trust you, that kind of a thing. So what are some of the lessons learned from Microsoft in terms of its security, approach to security? As you play such a pivotal role, you also are, in many ways, offer so many different services to the U.S. government as well as other nations and the private sector. How will you regain that trust as well as lessons learned from this past year?
Well, I think the first lesson learned is just, I think all of the big tech companies and frankly many of the smaller but critical tech companies are real targets today. When you have a world where you see so many attacks every day, we're definitely in the crosshairs of some of these countries. And the unfortunate thing for Microsoft last year was 2 attacks got through. Now, tens of millions were defeated, but we can't afford 2, we can't afford 1. We have to always ensure that the number is 0. So we really had to go back to square one, which we've done. And we launched an initiative. The good news is we launched it last fall. We didn't wait for a government report or a congressional hearing, and are just reworking the engineering systems of every single thing across the company. And we have launched the single largest engineering project for cybersecurity in the history of digital technology, roughly the equivalent of 35,000 full-time engineers focused on security. We just have to keep taking steps as we are. We have to keep making progress as we are. We have to share, I think, in a very transparent way, the steps we're taking, which we have done, and now the progress we are making, which we'll start to provide shortly and continue on a quarterly basis. The good news from my perspective is, in some ways, there's trust and there's confidence. Trust is usually, in my opinion, focused on whether someone shares your values. Do you think about things the same way? Confidence is about whether they'll deliver. And so I think for us, the issue has been in retaining and rebuilding confidence. And that's what we're doing.
Great. Let's shift to AI governance and the work that you're doing, Ambassador, as well as Brad, globally on that front. As of now, what we've seen is a lot of commitment from different governments on basic sort of concept of safety. What is and in your role, and I've heard you talk, Ambassador, about sort of threading the needle between innovation as well as appropriate safety regulations or safety guardrails. What is the best argument in your mind right now for voluntary AI safety commitments from the private sector? And how do you balance what our approach as a government has done so far, which is no regulations on the high level, with what's happening in Europe in terms of their AI Safety Act?
Yeah. So the president was fond of saying, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. And I actually think of the voluntary commitments in similar terms. Voluntary, to your question, in our view, was essential for two reasons. First, voluntary doesn't constrain innovation. And make no mistake, we are involved in the early stages of a global competition for which metaphorical operating system will become the dominant one in key technology areas. And I think it's absolutely essential, we think it's absolutely essential, that a rights-respecting operating system in AI become the dominant operating system in the world. And that requires the United States, many of our close partners, and the companies that are domiciled and built inside our countries are the winners. So voluntary is essential because it doesn't constrain innovation. So much of our influence in the world now is downstream of our ability to maintain an edge in these key technologies. Traditional measures that we're accustomed to, like GDP and military capacity, are downstream of leadership positions in these key technologies. That's one reason why voluntary mattered. The second reason why voluntary mattered is it's fast. And we could not get into a regulatory swirl akin to the EU AI Act at a time when the technology is moving so quickly. So the view in this administration was voluntary commitments were a necessary and important first step toward a more fulsome governance architecture without undercutting the innovative power of the American private sector and without getting us into a very slow regulatory process. They may not be the last step, but they were an essential first step. And so now we're working hand in hand with the leading companies in the G7, in the OECD, and in larger and larger multilateral fora around the world to continue building out that governance architecture. At the same time, if you'll indulge me for 20 more seconds, there's a second track that's equally important, which is ensuring that every human being on this planet has access to the benefits of AI. And we were talking in the green room about some just incredibly powerful examples now, translating 300 pages of Russian text into Spanish in 10 seconds at the State Department. I mean, think about the labor-saving benefit of that. But the application of emerging technologies to alter the trajectory toward achievement of the UN Sustainable Development Goals and things like climate modeling and agricultural productivity. So there's a governance track and there's an AI for good, for sustainable development track, and we need to do both.
And that said, how do you make sure that some of the mistakes, if you will, that happened during the advent and the growth of the social media industry don't befall this industry as well, and the government's role?
So look, I'll be very clear about this. I mean, our foreign policy, U.S. foreign policy on any topic will never be any stronger than our domestic policy on that topic. And the U.S. in many fora is under significant pressure because of what we've seen with the social platforms. And we have to acknowledge that. That is a simple, observable truth in our foreign policy. And to Brad's point, in terms of maintaining not only trust, but also maintaining confidence, I think we as a government are going to have to square our domestic and international approaches with the platforms and with AI.
You know, in no other industry that I've covered within technology have I heard such polar arguments for the potential and the great risks related to, as I have with AI. Brad and Ambassador, how are you thinking about sort of, you know, this is really simplistic, but there's those who say that it's going to, the doom scenario, then there's the save the world scenarios. Where do you see AI practically, and how are you, Ambassador, talking to your counterparts around the world about these two different sort of arguments? And Brad, how do you as a company navigate those two different scenarios and the regulatory landscape? Maybe Brad, you can start.
Well, let me try to weave a few things together. I mean, first of all, I think that there's probably a little bit of overwrought exaggeration sometimes in people either claiming that AI is going to save every aspect of the world or destroy every part of humanity. It's usually a little less than that, and that's a good thing. Turns out that humans matter even more than technology. And if you want to put it in context, there absolutely is one huge technology that was more extreme on both ends, and that's obviously the harnessing of the atom. Now, if you build on that notion, to me, what is fascinating about this past year is personally, I believe that what the US government did, both domestically and internationally, was really provide a masterclass in fast-moving global diplomacy on a par, in my view, with what the Eisenhower administration did with Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace initiative, combining bilateral and multilateral diplomacy that made it possible to export nuclear power around the world. On a par with what the US government did, say, in creating They saw that there was one model emerging that felt to most Americans a little heavy-handed in Europe. So they said, let's have an alternative. The voluntary commitments, worth remembering, that went from the first meeting at the White House in May to signed commitments in July to concrete commitments. It then got translated into an executive order by August of more than 100 pages. Voluntary commitments in the US then became a voluntary code of conduct for AI developers around the world and completely changed the conversation. And there's a lot that will now be built, but there's a blueprint. And the hardest thing when you're starting with nothing is to create a blueprint. It has changed the whole world, including the countries that are not part of the G7, in how we all think about what we need to ensure that AI can be used and used safely.
Ambassador.
I wholeheartedly agree with every word of that, Brad, thank you. And to your question of where are we on the doom spectrum, I think it's really important to remember some of the other ideas that were put forward. Think about what the alternative courses were to the one that Brad described. Remember the idea of a pause, right? Some sort of a global pause on AI development. A wildly unrealistic proposal that would have resulted only in the responsible actors pausing and the irresponsible actors sprinting ahead. So I think that the only way that we can have the architecture in place to deal with the mitigation of the really dangerous downside risks is because we followed the path that we followed. And now at least there is a significant, and I mean like dozens of countries wide, emerging consensus on what governance is going to look like and how we're going to deal with transgressions.
Well, we are out of time. We're all going to watch Moldova. We're all going to go to lunch. We're going to, after that, see Brad testify on the Hill. It's a busy, thank you so much. Thank you very much, Ambassador Brad.